and welcome to the Deutsche Welle session at the World Economic Forum on Africa. My name is Edith Kimani, and we're coming to you from Kigali in Rwanda for the benefit of our global audience, also known as the Land of 1,000 Hills. Now, Africa's population is surging. In fact, UNICEF estimates that in the next 35 years, 1.8 billion babies are going to be born in Africa, essentially doubling the population and pushing the number of those under the age of 18 to 1 billion. Power demand will grow fourfold. And in order to meet this demand, countries will need to add 292 gigawatts of new capacity over the next 25 years. And so today we're asking, how can Africa leapfrog towards developing a smart energy system? To help me discuss those questions, I do have a very gender-balanced panel here. And we'll begin to my extreme left with Mr. Erastus Mwencha. He's the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union. And he's also a self-proclaimed Pan-Africanist with 30 years experience in policy formulation and institutional transformation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Edith.
On my extreme right, I'm joined by Jibril Adewale Tinubu. He is the Group Chief Executive of Owando PLC, Africa's largest integrated energy solution provider, at least according to your website. Thank you for joining us. And to the ladies now, on my left, I'm joined by Jacqueline Novogratz. She's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Acumen. Acumen, by the way, has invested $101 million in 92 companies. That's $101 million. And Jacqueline is also a best-selling author, and according to Forbes, she's one of the top 100 global thinkers. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And finally, Jasandra Naika, who is a Chief Executive Officer of Biotherm Energy, a renewable energy investment that is also an independent project with a development platform focused on sub-Saharan Africa. She also is a young global leader. Thank you for joining us, Jasandra.
Thank you.
We encourage you in our audience once more to participate online as well using the hashtag #FutureEnergy. And so let me begin with the people on my right, Jasandra and Tinubu, because you're both players in the sector. And so Jasandra, based on your experience in the energy sector, what does the future of smart energy look like to you?
I think the future of, and excuse the pun, but the future of smart energy is very bright. There's great potential and opportunity on the African continent, and in terms of the question is, how do we actually deploy the opportunity that has arisen? Given the growth rates in Africa, given the fact that a large portion of this population will also migrate to cities over the next 20 years, there's an opportunity for both on and off-grid technology as well as power facilities to come online.
Okay. Tinubu, Jasandra is saying that there's great potential, but we seem to always be talking about potential. Given your experience, do you think it's actionable?
I don't think we have a choice. You know, over 50% of the continent doesn't have access to energy of any sort. So we do need to take conventional sources and add those to the renewable sources. And we do need to have a policy that seeks to drive renewable energy to compensate for the shortfalls we have from other conventional sources like coal or gas or oil sources.
And so following up on that, do you think that Africa will get to a point where we are relying solely on this smart energy solutions, green energy, completely getting rid of fossils?
Well, I mean, I don't think we can completely get rid of fossils. If not, I'll be out of a job and Rwanda will have no commercial existence. But I think that we do have over 100 years of oil on the continent. We have over 600 years of gas supply to power the whole continent and over 400 years of coal. So the question is, it's the energy mix that's important. And as we've known, Africa has been known to leapfrog technology and take the benefit of global evolution. And I see us being able to take that opportunity in the power sector by using a lot of the benefits of innovation, global innovation. For example, in Abu Dhabi, solar power, they've been able to get it down to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. which is under the price today of conventional power sources.
Right. We'll get into pricing later, but you did mention technology and how Africa has been able to leapfrog in that sector. But it's also being used together with energy. We have M-Pesa, M-Copper being used to bring access to renewable power to people in Africa. Jacqueline, you do know quite a bit about this, don't you?
Yeah, Acumen has been investing in off-grid solar companies for the last 10 years and has invested in about over 20 of those companies, really taking it from 2006 when we first invested in D-Light, which had a single solar torch, and as you were saying, the price was $4 a watt at that time. Over the last 10 years, we've seen 3 major shifts in technology that aren't just in the solar space, but in the cell phone space, as you said, Edith. On the solar space, you've seen the price come down by more than 80%. You've seen batteries prolonging their lives. The cell phone revolution actually has 2 components to it. On the one hand, because almost every African now owns a phone, and we're seeing people move so quickly into smartphones, as an off-grid provider, you can have a direct relationship with every one of your customers, with your sales force, and you can use your phones to meter and to monitor. That connects to the second thing that you mentioned, which is when M-Copa came on in 2011, which from my perspective was the beginning of the off-grid solar revolution at household and mini-grid level, is that now people could pay for their home systems in the same way that they could pay for kerosene on a daily basis. And if they stopped paying, the companies could turn off their units. So the credit risk has dropped dramatically. So you have those 3 components working together. And we've seen in the case of D-Light, 30% of all Kenyan rural households now own one of those products. There's a 70% brand recognition. M-Copa has already reached 1 million people. D-Light globally has reached 60 million. We can accelerate these numbers off-grid as part of that mix in a way that's faster, less expensive, and more effective for the rural population in ways that sometimes will connect to the grid, and in other cases will be a destination in and of itself. Doesn't even need to be a bridge. And that is thrilling. And as you were saying, that's where Africa can really be a leader in the world. And as an American, I feel jealous seeing it.
So, Mwencha, having worked with so many African countries, do you think that governments are creating policies that will enable such penetration and access to happen?
Yes. Well, it's not acceptable this day and age that in Africa you have over 600 million people without access to energy. That means for Africa, you are looking at for every 3 people, 2 don't have access. It's actually a scandal because in some cases, like the case of my brother from Nigeria, producing petroleum but importing consumption again. So there are now many initiatives in the continent which start from, of course, even under what we call the NEPAD programs. We have developed programs which have got to do with policy, but also encouraging partnership with the private sector, because the figures we are mentioning, if you look at in terms of investment, we require almost $1 trillion to access, for people to access that energy.
Yeah.
And so one must then develop a strategy of how to mobilize those resources for the people to access that energy.
And so, Jasandra, you obviously know the importance of the partnership between government and the private sector. And in South Africa, this has worked really well. Could you please tell us more about that?
Sure. So South Africa has a renewable energy independent power producer program. It kicked off in July of 2011, and as of yesterday, there were 2.3 gigawatts of installed renewable energy on the grid. So in a very short period of time, roughly 5 years, and let me just say that the first set of projects that were awarded actually only started construction in November of 2012. So in a space of 3.5 years, we've managed to bring 2.3 gigawatts of additional clean energy to the grid. And that has been a partnership, to use your word, between government and independent power producers. And this is where the private sector has really shown, ensuring that these projects come online on time Most of them have overperformed what was expected. We've helped in terms of improving infrastructure. And in addition to that, most of the independent power producers have also deployed a local community program. So in addition to producing power, a sliver of revenues is being used towards economic development, enterprise development, and socioeconomic initiatives that serve the community in which they operate.
Okay, so the benefits are pretty clear. So Mwencha, why is there such a big difference between the countries who are investing and doing really well, such as South Africa, and the ones who aren't?
Well, of course, policies at the national level don't necessarily move in tandem for the whole continent. There are evaluations, there are some differences. But I think if you look at the mobilization that is now taking place and the awareness, there is that general search forward. And you can see, for instance, a number of programs which are underway in terms of grid connections. In other words, even under regional cooperation, there is that very concerted effort to do that.
Wale, do you think the private sector is being left to carry the burden of this transformation, or are governments, as Mwencha is saying, really involved?
Well, I'm an avowed capitalist, so I do believe that the governments should do what they do best, which is create an enabling environment, and the private sector should be spur growth in the continent. And I think it's particularly important in Africa because we're dealing with limited sources of capital, and we're dealing with great explosive demand, particularly from population and also from industrialization, from people going from poverty into the middle class. So there's a big demand for goods and services. In Nigeria, we suffered by subsidizing power, and what happened was with the consistent demand pools, it's 3% growth in population on an annualized basis. We went from a $30 billion economy 20 years ago to a $550 billion economy last year. And we ended up producing 50% of our electricity via private diesel generators owned by homes at approximately 20 cents per kilowatt hour, when we could have had industrial power generated at 4 cents or 5 cents. And what was missing was having an enabling environment, which the government has finally realized and has privatized the power system, liberalized tariffs. And in the process, we're now seeing the private sector getting involved in building new power plants, and we're now attracting global capital.
Right.
So the difference is that power is now seen as a business opportunity for investors to make a return, whilst it's seen, and it's effectively a social palliative, because people now have access to cheaper power than when the government was subsidizing and unable to meet that demand.
Okay, so let's go to Jacqueline, because you did mention the social aspect of this. We do know that energy is definitely a key driver of the economy, but the social benefits are tremendous, especially when people go off the grid.
Absolutely, and I just want to pick up a little too on what Wale was saying, because if you look at the leadership, and it's connected to what you were saying as well, the leadership is stepping up in a different way, recognizing the social and the economic benefit. And so President Kagame has a 22% off-grid goal for Rwanda as part of the overall energy. That's partially understanding that if you are talking about energy, you are talking about the opposite of poverty in many ways. And so the social benefits are imagining rural households, 2/3 of Africa, that can start to see their rooftops as mini power stations, that you move immediately from darkness literally into light, that we see health benefits overnight. 36% of all respiratory is connected to kerosene. It's very expensive. And so now people are earning more income, there's more productivity, jobs are created. I've already talked about health, the environment, needless to say. So from an investment perspective, if we start to think about our returns, financially, they're there in the off-grid space.
Okay, so Mwencha, let me come back to you on that while we're still talking about these partnerships between public and private. Would you say that there is a political and perhaps even legal interference, and more specifically the issue of corruption when it comes to implementing energy projects?
Well, I think, of course, you cannot deny that there is no corruption, but then you must create structures that minimize or eliminate corruption. One of them, of course, as my brother said earlier on, you must segregate. For instance, government cannot be a producer, a regulator, and a player at the same time. So if you separate some of those, you minimize. And of course, there are now schemes, for instance, in terms of procurement to make sure that you develop them in such a way that you have systems that are accountable and also transparent. So that is indeed an issue. And just picking on what she was talking about earlier on government policy, you saw leaders seated here yesterday, all committed, and you have seen that leadership. And so some of the areas that we need to pursue, for instance, incentives. For instance, elimination of tariffs on solar panels so that you can encourage off-grid so that people then can access. Yes, there are schemes to try and tackle those issues, but also expand access.
Okay, Jasandra, I know you did say that the incentives to invest in energy seem to be skewed. They seem to be wrong. What should the incentives be based on what Wencha said?
I agree with Wencha in terms of government needs to separate its roles. The incentives are really a good regulatory environment, a willingness to realize that this is a sense of urgency, and in order to implement and roll out new or smart energy, there needs to be a time frame in place. So, we see some, especially in West Africa, a fair number of the governments and regulatory authorities who are very keen to make sure that they accelerate the rollout. In Burkina Faso, for example, the intention is that these projects start construction no later than January of next year, and you need to be operating in the same year. And I think that's great. The sense of urgency that's coming through is important, but it's not everywhere. It's happening only in some countries. A fantastic example, actually, was Uganda's Get Fit program, where together with the DFI, the Ugandan government decided to roll out a renewable energy program. There were small projects, there were 5 megawatts each. It was a tender-based program. There was a part subsidy provided by a DFI. There was a bankable PPA in place, and the projects got built. They're currently in construction, and I think 1 or 2 are actually going to start operating now. And that's speed to market. Not every country in Africa has a huge energy need from a grid-connected perspective. And therefore, when you look at how to deploy these projects, you should look at what, firstly, the grid can hold, but also the other opportunity in terms of, well, what could we do at an off-grid, at a rural basis, rather than bringing everybody into the cities?
Right. And so do you think that while that policy uncertainty, if that could be corrected, then what Jasandra is talking about could be accelerated?
Yeah, I definitely think so, because what we're trying to do is attract capital, not just from international sources, but also from within our local environment. And the only way you can do that is by having structured policies which reward those who invest in power sources that are sustainable. I would like to see if there's a choice to subsidize, and subsidies should be driven towards renewable sources, which can be done off-grid in a decentralized manner to help people in rural communities access to electricity or power in general. And we do need to focus really on ensuring there's more regional cooperation.
I believe very strongly that there is a lot of capital out there waiting and ready to come into the energy sector. But if, for instance, you have tariffs which do not reflect the cost of production, you discourage that. So there is need. But then you must also then address the issues you mentioned, structure, the energy sector, that policies around it, that you can have distribution company, generation company, not all doing the same thing so that you can encourage off-grid. I think that is really part of the reforms that we need to encourage capital flow into energy.
Okay, we have a question off of Twitter. It's by iChaffer, and touching on the issue of technology, I think, Jasandra, I'd like you to take this. More technology could disrupt the job market and create larger inequalities in Africa. How do we avoid that? I suppose it's technology, specifically a lot of technology too quickly in one sector.
I don't see how more technology is going to make it more jobs or create more greater disparity. I actually think if we look at what technology has done over the last 10 to 20 years, it's been disruptive, but it's actually allowed for greater dissemination to a much larger population than ever before. And I like to use the mobile phone in Africa as a fantastic example. When it first started, it was few and far between. But when it started becoming cheap, everyone has it. And I think I've been told that that in some countries in Africa, the average person has 2 or 3 phones, depending on which cell phone coverage he needs at a particular point in time. So it's become a point of time where the more technology we've had, the greater competition, the cost of production has come down significantly. And we're also seeing that in the solar sector. I mean, the cost of production is significantly lower. And to your point, more recently, Dubai announced that their solar program has resulted in a price of 2.99 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's fantastic. I mean, we're really seeing the impact of technology, and it's allowing for greater access to more people.
Yeah. So greater technology, in your opinion, definitely a good thing.
Yes.
But I want to look at the barriers in specific sectors. And while just out of curiosity, what do you think is a key barrier when it comes to achieving the potential for hydropower, for example? Or more specifically, I think solar.
We do need cost-reflective tariffs as a priority. Mm-hmm. We need transparency in the opportunities. We need speed in terms of decision making, mm-hmm. and we need the capacity to merge sources of public funding with private sector funding. And I say that because certain projects will not be bankable on day one, and that's where you need the government to step in with, say, 20%, for example, on a hydro project. Okay, and then you have DFIs can come in for maybe 30-40%, and then commercial credit or debt could do the rest. The challenge you have is that in order to make energy projects bankable, you need to you have a long-term period where there's a gestation where the economics doesn't make sense. First couple of years in particular, because at the end of the day, as people key on to the system, it becomes cheaper and cheaper, and there's a marginal reduction in the cost. So this is where the public-private sector projects really make the difference. And of course, classic examples, you're not going to have a straightforward hydro project without elements of the public sector, because there's water, you're dealing with rural areas, you're dealing with flooding, you're dealing with, in certain instances, deforestation when you launch a hydro project. Okay? And you need the private sector capital, because at the end of the day, most governments are strapped with the inability to provide appropriate funding across the board for health, education, and all the other things. But I think Africa is one of those continents where the only way we can truly develop, okay, is to make ourselves the true bride for global private sector investment, because the demand exists, okay, for the product. We're potentially the largest power market in the world. I mean, we have it's ridiculous when you compare our statistics in terms of what we consume to what countries like, for example, Vietnam consumes 4 times more electricity than Nigeria does, yet Nigeria is 5 times more in terms of population, or even twice as much in terms of GDP. So there's a misplaced priorities in terms of the way and manner in which the economies are developing, and we're losing a wonderful opportunity to leapfrog out of poverty by not having a more sustainable or robust energy policy.
Okay, except you've somehow managed to encourage investment despite the lack of clear policies. Well,
it's one reason that I think that you're seeing much of the innovation happening in Kenya and Rwanda. And South Africa. It's so interesting listening to you, Gisandra, because the tariffs in Kenya and Rwanda are very good now for entrepreneurs working in the solar area. And so I think that the opportunity is to get better government policy and to, again, move into the financing part, because it's time to really accelerate the financing into these companies, and to recognize that the kind of financing that's needed needs to understand that we're still at an innovation moment, that we don't have all of the answers yet in the world to what it will take to fully accelerate, particularly at the mini-grid level. But at the home system level, we have a lot of the technologies. Now we need to scale them. And if you think about the fact that it takes most governments about $1,000 to connect a rural household to the grid, and it will take a number of years to extend that grid. On the other hand, the a 5-10 watt system. Most of MCOPA systems are 8 watts. D-lights are between 5 and 10. If you at that starter level, is more like $150 that can be financed by the household itself over a 1 to 2 year period. You fully change the economics of what it will take to reach the rural poor.
Okay, although we do have some very unique challenges in Africa sometimes. So in Kenya, for example, there's an investor who's available, but problems of land and the community around it then stall these projects. And I know you're shaking your head because it's obviously quite sad, but Mwencha, apart from, as we wait for policy implementation, what are some of the things that even people at community level can do?
I think that's a real problem, particularly if we're going to talk of projects like solar. At the moment, the technology we have, you occupy a huge space to be able to produce a megawatt. And so there is need for those entrepreneurs entering that sector also to be aware of how you manage local communities. Part of it, of course, then might be, if you're producing this energy, serve the community immediately, or involve them in the project, give them some equity, so that you can solve the problem of land, because that is a situation that you also need to integrate rural communities so that they can now benefit. So.
Okay, I'd just like to open the conversation up to the audience. If we have any questions, we'll start taking them now. We have a question here.
Yeah, hi, my name is Peter. I'm with the Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet. I was wondering, I've talked to a Swedish CEO of an energy company who showed me some statistics about the potential in solar power. And in his regard, the potential of solar power decides where the future of manufacturing will be. And basically what he said was that, well, the majority of the potential is in Africa. So how big do you think the potential is when it comes to solar power? Can it actually also make Africa become the new hub of manufacturing, or the home of industrial manufacturing?
Jassandra, I think I'd like you to take that, given that you deal with solar.
Okay, great. Well, very good question. The potential of solar on the African continent is huge. No doubt about that. And I smiled when you asked the question about local manufacturing, because within the South African program, local content is a key aspect in terms of you actually being competitive in the auction. However, we need to look at what we want to do from a manufacturing perspective. If the intention is job creation, how do we actually do that? And what is our supply side in terms of skill sets looking like relative to the jobs that we need to create? So I do think over time it could become a great manufacturing hub and a fully vertically integrated manufacturing hub. But for now, I do think that there is opportunity if companies, manufacturers can actually see a longer-term horizon in terms of projects being deployed across the African continent, be it off-grid or on-grid for that matter, and that there is pipeline, and that the ability for them to invest that capital that is required to set up that manufacturing facility can actually pay back. I do think that there'll be more and more interest in terms of setting up manufacturing facilities on the African continent.
All right, the lady at the front.
Thank you. My name is Joyce Ann Wainaina, and I think this particular conversation is very interesting for various reasons. I mean, this is really the story about Africa. I'd like to first go back to the very first point that I believe Wale made. Africa has about 100 years of oil, 400 years of something else, and it kind of links to your question. How many years of solar do we have on the continent? I would say that's about 1 billion. Or more, and that is really where the potential is. And solar combined with Africa's new disruptive force, which is mobile. I have visited MCOPA, and to me that is the true disruptor. But what I do agree though is that we do need a combination of everything, because solar mobile is almost a domestic solution. But for real industry, we do need the coal, we do need the oil, etc. But we have to think about how it affects us from a clean energy solution perspective. The challenge or the question that I have is, we keep looking at how do we make this continent-wide. We look at non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, almost always thinking about it in terms of goods, but we don't think about it in terms of service. How do we export the idea of solar mixed with mobile across Africa? How do we get this done?
Okay, Wale, I think...
Yeah, I think the challenge really with our continent and planning for our future is really that we don't really plan, put it that way. We have a myriad sources of energy which we could tap, and the question is, what comes first? What's our short-term plan, a medium-term plan, and a long-term plan? What's available? And how do we get this different sources of energy into a national policy or continent-wide policy and get it implemented over time, no different from how we've taken positions on corruption or taking positions on regional integration, like we've done with SADC and ECOWAS and COMISA, and effectively create an energy policy for the continent. Because I think it's really, without a doubt, the biggest challenge we have to economic growth is really our poor consumption of energy and our very expensive consumption of energy. We're never going to become an exporting continent until we lower our cost of energy and we take advantage of these different sources. 50% of our population right now is no longer in rural areas, it's now in the urban areas. You're not going to find many solar solutions working in the urban areas in the short term. In the short term, you need conventional power, and that's where electricity will come in. It's going to be either, somebody said, either going to be via oil, which is one of the biggest sources, okay, gas, or hydro, for example, in the short term. And in the medium term, we can start to take the benefits of other solutions, for example, the remote solutions which we could deal with in terms of the rural areas. There's so much investment that's already gone into creating grids, okay? And those grids are very inefficient, okay? The systems are done. I mean, we were able in Nigeria to build a 150-kilometer gas pipeline over the last 10 years to take away 80% of the industrial capacity in Lagos State, moving them off conventional sources of energy onto a gas pipeline and reducing their power demand by 60%. Now, this was a private sector initiative done as a concession from the government, where we approached the government and said, look, you've got this gas, you don't do anything with this gas, okay? We will take project risk, we'll build out a pipeline, we'll sign off customers, and we're able to go around customers, okay? And we built the pipeline in 5 phases, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 40 kilometers, and signed up customers and made each section bankable as we went along.
Okay.
So the point I'm making is that we start with, first of all, planning, put the mix together in terms of all the different sources, take into account our demand pools, our population growth, for example, take into account affordability, because a lot of countries can't afford these things. So we can speak all we want about hydro projects, but a hydro project is a huge capital endeavor which many countries cannot afford. Okay, the only way they're going to afford it is by a combination of all the different pools of capital and demand coming together to create a bankable project. And until then, we're going to need to focus on an African solution for an African problem.
Okay, fantastic that you say that, because I'm really curious, Mwencha, whether when the AU comes back to sit here in Kigali a few months from now, if this is one of the things they'll be talking about, a continental policy on renewable energy.
We already have that framework. In fact, we have a sectoral setting where ministers of energy from Africa meet, power pools meet, and all stakeholders to develop policy. And even, as he said, we have also developed short-term, medium-term action plans based on available technology, capital outlays, and the rest, so that we can roll out. And as we roll out these projects, I mean, we are also even thinking of, Africa must start thinking of how do we have the capacity for nuclear. But of course, that, and for peaceful purposes. So it's not just pursuing one track all the time. But we are looking at all options and making all this in terms of what we can do today and investment in that line.
I know in our poll question we asked whether people think Africa will be fully electrified by a certain period of time. But let's take this further. Do you think Africa will ever be a net exporter of power?
Africa is already a net exporter of power. I mean, if you look at it, how would you define that? If you look at in terms of We are exporting, crude oil and the rest, which is used outside. We have coal. But yes, in fact, if you look at, for instance, the Inga project, which is now gaining momentum, that project can light Africa and Europe. So if we get capital, of course, it's a huge capital outlay. We can. And I think a day is coming that Africa can be able to do that.
Okay. Jacqueline.
Well, I want to go back to the other question quickly, because I actually would not bet against solar getting to the point where it will have industrial capacity. And so I think that it's a myth that it's the grid for industry only and off-grid. That we were talking about this before. We're starting to see mini grids get to a point where they will be able to provide this kind of industrial capacity. And so I actually think that we need this mixed structure, as everybody is talking about, and that if I were a young entrepreneur today, I would be focusing on the technologies that are needed, DC appliances, because Africa has a chance to change the whole system if we start to think about what we're seeing out there with innovation. And the final thing I would just say to this point is that in terms of how do we get it beyond the countries in which it's operating, is nothing breeds success like success. To sort of find those presidents and those countries that are really willing to work in partnership to build an ecosystem. And I dare say that's why we're focused on a major initiative in East Africa, to prove to the world what's possible on-grid and off-grid, is the more quickly other countries will take this up, because this is the moment.
Okay, well, then let's look at the poll results. We had asked, when do you think Africa will be fully electrified? A very overwhelming positive response there. 53% of you say 2040 and beyond. 2020 and 2030 seems a bit unrealistic, but there are also people who say never. What do you think, Jasandra? Does this surprise you, the poll result?
That some say never. I think when they're looking at fully electrified, and the view is probably one where they think it's never. But I guess it's how you're defining being electrified. And I think when we planned the question for the audience, ours was, well, it's both on and off grid. So in your home, in a village, having a solar a Delight solution or an M-Copa solution or a Mobicel solution, and at the same time we're talking about in the city. So perhaps the question was perhaps misconstrued, but I do think there is an opportunity for both on and off grid and a mix of energy solutions, both brown and green, if I could call it that. And I do think that we should aim for something better than never, and definitely not by 2040. I think it should happen sooner. If we really want to see the potential of Africa really being harnessed, we need to make this a real sense of urgency.
There's a statement here off of Twitter. There's a great impact if we maximize energy penetration in schools for education. Jacqueline, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I'm sure, Jasandra, you've been connected to that as well. We've been working with that through companies, again, that are focusing first on home system, are moving from the bottom up, and are now essentially, because the solar panels are modular, they are now going into the schools. I was just talking with B-Box here in Rwanda, and they have brought solar electricity to many, many schools. And what's so powerful about that, and it's a way that government and the DFIs can also work, is that then you are creating awareness. The kids then go home to their parents to talk about the applicability of solar in clinics in schools, which is again why I'm such a believer in this movement.
Okay, Mwancha, really quickly before we take closing remarks.
Well, I just wanted to answer those who said 2040 onwards. If you had asked me in 1990 how long it would take to get a phone, because I'd applied for a phone and waited for years, I would have said never. Now today you know what has happened. That's the answer.
Okay, well, we need to wrap up, so I'm going to once again go around and ask you the question we began with. How can Africa move towards a smart energy system? Some tangible examples. We'll begin with you, Wale.
I think certainly awareness. I mean, to be honest with you, I learned a lot being here today. And I think making smart energy a priority in the national policies such that it's something which is rolled in. Unfortunately, there's too much focus on conventional energy sources, and conventional energy sources are very, very expensive to deploy, and it usually require quite a bit of time. And that sense of urgency that's been mentioned repeatedly in our conversation today tends to suggest that we're only going to bridge this gap and achieve an objective, potentially in the next 20 years, by using very, very aggressive smart energy solutions as part of our overall energy mix.
Okay, Sandra, what are your views?
It is definitely not a green-only or off-grid world. It is definitely a combination of energy mix, big and small projects, and the medium-sized one as well. And I think what is also important is to look at what we've done in the past on the African continent. And we've had some transformational projects, Azura being one, Lake Turkana being another. Those took 10 to 12 years to actually develop and start construction. I think we can learn from that and see what could we accelerate in terms of adoption? How can we actually roll out?
Okay, Jacqueline.
I would say the similar, change the narrative, get the financing right. One thing that we didn't talk about is really invest in the human system. I think that a distributed system, as with cell phones, actually offers enormous opportunity to create jobs and increase people's individual income. And that finally, that the way that we build an energy future, to your point, Jacindra, is for all of us to get on board, the private sector, government, and civil society.
And finally, Mwencha.
Smart means clean energy, access, and technology. We are now sitting in exciting times, so we need innovation, we need investment, we need policies that will encourage all this.
Thank you very much for joining us, to our viewers here physically, to our viewers on the webcast, and obviously those who are joining us on TV. But we're concluding by saying, in order for us as a continent to achieve this dream, we need awareness, key policy implementation. A sense of urgency also needs to, the sense of urgency needs to grow, getting the financing right, and getting everyone on board. Thank you very much.